Good morning, everybody. Welcome to December Nonprofit Cafe. My name is Jill Elwood, and I am the Nonprofit Programming and Relations Manager here at the One Valley Community Foundation, where our mission is to connect people who care to causes that matter to build a better community. And one of the ways we do that is through nonprofit capacity building. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here and investing in your own professional development. Before we dive in, I have a couple of thank yous and announcements, and then I will turn it over for the good stuff. First and foremost, I want to give a big thank you to our headline sponsor, First Security Bank, who has been the headline sponsor of Nonprofit Cafe for the last 6 years, allowing us to provide this program for free to all of you. So big thank you to them always. And a huge, huge thank you to our speaker, Hannah, who is volunteering her time today to share her expertise with us, which we are so deeply grateful for. Normally, we do a little group intro, but I'm actually going to have Hannah do that. So we're going to hold off on the group intro for just a minute. So my regulars, you're probably like, Jill, you're doing things out of order, but we will get to it. We definitely want to know who is in the room. A couple of housekeeping items. Just remember to keep yourself muted if you're not actively speaking. Feel free to keep your video on. It is always more fun to teach a room full of friendly faces than just a big black screen. And then let's see. Oh, and I did mention this at the beginning, but if you just hopped on, this session is being recorded and we will send that out after the session. So feel free to take notes if you want to, but you will be able to refer back to this, so don't worry too much about it. With all of that being said, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker, Hannah Cortez. If you have not gotten to work with Hannah, you are in for a treat today. Not only is she one of the most knowledgeable grant writing and grant research experts in our community, but she is also just a gem of a human who I love working with. Hannah has been a grant specialist with the Dotted Eye since 2017, and she has raised over $3.2 million for her clients. Can you imagine being able to say that? How amazing is that? She is now the Director of Outreach and Education for the Dotted Eye as well. And so she does all of these amazing lectures and courses and trainings. And we are so, so, so stinking lucky and grateful to have Hannah taking the time to teach us here today. So with all of that being said, I'm going to turn it on over to Hannah, and then she will dive into content and do a little group introduction.
Thanks, Jill. You definitely know how to not only start a meeting on a lovely snowy Friday, but make a person just feel so special and loved. I appreciate it. All right, everyone. Let me share my screen with all of you. All right, can everyone see my screen? If you just give me a nice thumbs up, sounds great. Okay, welcome again, like Jill said, to Nonprofit Cafe. It's been a minute since I've done a Nonprofit Cafe, and I am so excited to be back in front of a local audience. Bree and I have been spending the last couple of years really expanding our reach into kind of the Pacific Northwest, but there is nothing like presenting to our Montana audience, and especially our local Gallatin Valley audience. So I am so excited to be here and to see all of your faces today. Like Jill said, I'm the lead grant specialist and director of outreach and education at the Dotted Eye. I've been there since 2017. And I absolutely love writing grants, winning grants, and especially teaching nonprofit individuals like yourselves. So I'm really excited to connect with all of you. If you have questions, I am always happy to chat. You are welcome to connect with me via email or LinkedIn. My information will be on the slide. So if you feel like chatting about grants, just let me know. All right. Like Jill said, we have a group introduction and an icebreaker. I love the holidays. I love Halloween. I love Thanksgiving. I love Christmas. I love New Year's. I love it all. So what I would love for everyone to do, just to embrace the spirit of the season, is please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, who you're representing today, and what your favorite holiday treat is. And we'll take just a couple of minutes to see what some of you have to share, and then we'll start diving into some content. I love seeing when the number starts getting bigger. This may or may not have been a good idea. I haven't quite eaten breakfast yet, and now I'm like, oh man, some of this sounds so good. Pam, welcome. Hello. Pam's favorite holiday treat is oatmeal monster cookies. Those sound delicious. Our very own Jill Elwood loves a good cinnamon roll. Um, I love a good cinnamon roll too. Mandy, welcome. Mandy loves anything dipped in white chocolate. Ooh, that white chocolate's hard to beat. Anything chocolate's hard to beat. Um, Nell from the traveling school, welcome. Happy to have you this morning. You're the same as me, Nell. I love anything peppermint, peppermint bark, peppermint hot chocolate, peppermint cake. Like I'll just eat a candy cane, just straight peppermint. So I feel you on that. Good morning, Anne and Leslie. Welcome. We've got a lot of Chloe. Welcome. We've got a lot of cookie lovers in the house this morning. Andy, good morning. Andy's favorite holiday treat is a dark chocolate Earl Grey tart with mascarpone cream. That sounds fantastic. Oh my goodness. We've got peanut butter blossoms, Kringles, power. Oh, I'm sorry. That was an organization, not a treat. Um, Ginger snaps, peppermint sugar cookies. Those sound delicious. Yeah, this may have been not the move this morning because now I just want all of these. I also saw our good friend Mary Peterson on here. I don't see her in the chat yet, but I know Mary is a wonderful baker, so I'm excited to see what she has to say. Alex, Lauren, welcome. Grant, welcome. All right. It is so wonderful to see all of you this morning. I'm definitely going to go through this chat and see who was represented here today. I wish I could go through and just say hi to each and every one of you with your wonderful names and organizations, but I will be looking at your treats later. That is for sure. All right. Thank you all for participating and for being here and joining in on this group introduction. Let's go ahead and dive in to some grant related content. Okay, so we're going to try to keep this pretty focused today. I love talking about grants, so it's really easy for me to just like kind of start going down grant rabbit holes. But today we are talking about strategy. We are going to talk about grant strategy specifically for the upcoming year. Now you'll hear me mention next year as 2024. I'm basing my conversation today off of the fiscal year that is the calendar year, looking at January to December fiscal years. Now, if you're on here and your fiscal year does not run with the calendar year, that's okay. You can still check in on your grant process, adopt some of these strategies wherever you're at, and for your next fiscal year, really implement some of these things. But I just want to make sure there isn't any confusion when I'm talking today about the next fiscal year. I am referring to the fiscal year that runs with the calendar year. But we're going to be talking about grant strategy and how we can develop that, with information that we learned from our current fiscal year and really develop an approach and a strategy for grants, just like we would with fundraising, just like we would with marketing and programming, so that everything feels really cohesive and well aligned with your purpose, your goals, and your capacity. Today we'll talk a little bit about the grant landscape. We won't spend too much time on that, but I think it is important to just kind of understand what trends are emerging. And then really try to talk about some of the different tactics you can use around building a strategy, like, really looking at your budget, your cash flow, what are your goals, how, not even necessarily from a programmatic standpoint, but from a grant standpoint, how do you set goals on how many grants you want to submit? So we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then your homework assignment will be to build out your calendar for 2024. We see a lot of nonprofits come through our business and utilize our services who have a semi idea of what they want to approach in the next year. But, I think especially in a digital world where we're inundated with, oh, hey, here's this grant opportunity and here's a newsletter and an email. It's real easy to not have a concrete plan. And I don't know about you, but is there anyone else in the room, like when you have a plan and it's like written out, you just the weight of the world is lifted off your shoulders when you have a solid plan in place. And that's what we want you all to feel, is like you have a plan in place for your grant. So that stress isn't, overwhelming you when you actually go to sit and write them. So we'll go over a document that we utilize internally at the Dotted I with a lot of our clients and share that with all of you to compile your research and really try to build out your calendar. And then if we have time at the end, I'm always open for Q&A. I'm going to try real hard to make sure we have time at the end for Q&A. But if not, you are always welcome to call me and chat about grants. So diving right in, the first thing you should know when you're thinking about strategy, right, is understanding the grant landscape. What is going on in the funding sector, with private foundations, with corporate foundations, even with state, local, state, and federal grants. It's really important to know your audience, right? Just like you would with individual fundraising or end of the year appeals, knowing what individual giving is looking like, knowing what your audience or your target audience wants and needs, what their priorities are. You want to do that for grants too. So you kind of want to get a sense of what the landscape looks like. And for those of you who may not, be a grant writer by trade, you might not know what this looks like other than just from some experience and trends that you've gathered yourself. So the first thing I want to talk about is one, the Giving USA 2023 infographic. Now, for note, the Giving USA 2023 giving trends has collected data from 2022. So we're looking at trends that are, slightly outdated. We will be getting our 2024 Giving USA infographic once 2023 has completed. But this is the information we have, and I'll be able to speak a little bit to some of the things that we've been seeing in our own practice. But this is a really great starting point for anyone who's interested, not only about grants, but just kind of the state of fundraising in general. One thing to note is that 20% of all giving comes from foundations, or at least it did in 2022. Now, that was an increase over 2021, but you have to account for inflation, and that actually was a little bit of a decline. So that's not to be all doom and gloom, right? We don't want to cast negativity on your grant writing process, but it's important to be aware and to be knowledgeable in what the sector is doing. Because while 21% of giving is still coming from foundations, we are seeing a bit of a decline. And I think in the last few quarters of 2023, we've also been seeing a decline in fundraising in general. So why is that important to know? Well, because you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket, right? Grants are a part of your strategy, not the strategy, right? You want to incorporate them into your fundraising plan, but doing so strategically and effectively. So that means, giving is coming, the total number or percentage of giving from foundations is 21%. You probably don't want your budget to reflect much more than that, right? Now, I say that cautiously because some organizations by nature have larger percentages of funding coming from grant sources. You might be funded largely by state and federal grants. So maybe your grant makeup, percentage, which we'll get to a poll question in just a few minutes, is knowing, what percentage of grants make up your budget. If you're an organization that relies on grants in a different way, that's okay. That's not to say that what you're doing is bad, but you want to know and understand that percentage so that you can make strategic decisions on what grants to apply to, how many. Do you need to focus areas in your fundraising efforts in other areas? So it's really, it's crucial information to know kind of what the sector is looking like, so that you can try to adopt similar trends if it works for your organization. So that's one thing of note. We did see a slight increase, but actually it adjusted for inflation. We are seeing some decline. Now, some of that might be, just to note, we saw a mass influx of grants, right? In 2020, 2021, and even some, in 2022. But we're starting to level out in 22 and now in 23. So this decline might be because, you know, foundation giving has leveled back out. So take that, you know, with a grain of salt, and be aware that even this decline might just mean that foundation giving is kind of going back to normal levels post-pandemic. All right, the next thing that was really interesting, I don't know if any of you have seen the state of grant seeking report. I do have it linked here and I'll try to pull it up. But you can find it on Grant Station. It is a great tool to look through to just see specifically what the state of grant seeking looks like for any given year. And for 2023, one thing that was really interesting was the trend of organizations that submitted at least 3 grants increased their frequency of winning. And I have some statistics here that is really pretty awesome. 90% of orgs who participated in this study, who submitted between 3 to 5 applications, won at least 1 grant award. 98, like the more applications you submit, the higher your chances go. So 98% of orgs who submitted 6 to 10 applications reported winning at least 1 award. And then 99 to roughly 100% of organizations who submitted 11 or more grant applications reported winning at least 1 grant award. So grants is really a numbers game. Jill, I know we have a couple of poll questions, so I'm going to pause for a moment to let Jill do some of our polls just so we can kind of see what information you know about some of these trends that we've talked about. So the first one is, what was the largest source of total grant funding for your organization this year? And when I mean this year, I mean 2023 fiscal year. If you don't operate on that fiscal year, I would just suggest doing year to date. Give you a minute to fill that out, and then we'll see what the results are.
This is fascinating and seeing the results come in. We're at about 60% participation. So if you haven't filled it out yet, go ahead and jump in there. But these are not the results I was expecting. So I'm very excited to share them out.
I'm excited.
All right. I think we're going to go ahead and end it, and I'll share those results out.
Awesome. Okay, it looks like foundation grants were the winner by a large amount. 52% of people on this call had a lot of foundation funding last year, which I would say probably trends with kind of where giving is coming from, right? From the sector. We see a lot of giving coming from foundations, specifically private foundations. I am interested to see that corporate grants were lower than like federal and state. I know in the last few years, we've seen a larger, influx of state and federal funds being issued to nonprofits, again, kind of pre and post pandemic and recovery. So this is really interesting to see. Now, one thing that I think is important to know about this, it's great that you all have this information. I think this is important to know when you're developing your grant strategy, because then it can inform your research, right? When you're going to find other opportunities, it gives you a sense of, okay, do we need to diversify? Do I have a large bucket in foundation grants? Is that sustainable? Should I look at other grant options? Maybe state and federal would be, those are larger multi-year grants. Is my nonprofit ready for that? Maybe we should diversify into that area. Or, depending on where you're at with private foundation grants. Maybe there's still room to expand in that arena. Maybe you're like, we've barely, that was the largest funding bucket, but we've barely, scratched the surface of what we feel like is the potential out there. So this is really helpful information to know where your funding is coming from in terms of grants, not just fundraising in general, but where your grants are coming from, so that when you're researching, you can say, okay, we've put a lot of eggs in the basket of foundation grants. Maybe we should look at corporate sponsors. Have we talked to Jill about donor advised funds? That's something that could be really interesting. Are we ready, or do we have the project or scope to engage in state and federal grants? It just gives you more knowledge to be able to make strategic decisions on how to pursue grant opportunities. The next one, we're going to do another poll before we move on and keep diving into some content. Based on the frequency, right? If you submit at least 3 to 5 grants, your chances of winning at least one award goes up. I would love to know how many grant requests your organization submitted in 2023, and maybe see if that tracks with your experience. That statistic, if it tracks with your experience. We'll let people answer, and then I'm excited to see the results on this too.
I feel like folks are more confident in this answer than the last one because they're answering it quicker. We're already at 70%, but I'll give everyone a couple more seconds. I know there's a couple folks on here who might not know, but we shall see. We've got like 5 more seconds, then we'll close it.
Ooh, yay, 0%, and that you submitted no grants. We love that you're all submitting grants. Okay, this is an interesting split too. We have a vast array of grant submissions. So 22% of you submitted 1 to 2, which I think is really interesting in a world kind of, again, keep getting pre and post mixed up today, post-pandemic. We saw, I think, a larger focus when in-person events, right, became less secure. We saw this, shift to grant writing, digital fundraising. So it's interesting that there are still organizations out there who are submitting fewer grants, which there are a million reasons why you may be submitting fewer grants, right? It might be capacity. It might be that grants really aren't a great option for you. But this is such valuable information because you can see, okay, if we submitted 1 to 2, we have so much potential for growth, right? That's a wonderful strategy point to say we submitted 1 to 2 last year. This next year, maybe our goal is 3, because that increases our chances of winning at least one of those awards. So that's really interesting. And that 26% of you, roughly a little over half of you in different areas have submitted 6 to 10 or 11 to 20. Which is great because, again, those number brackets in the 6 to 10 and over 11 really increase your chances of winning. So I'd be interested in the comments, if you wouldn't mind sharing, if what percentage or what number bracket you submitted is trending with some of the data from the state of grant seeking. Have you won at least one award? And maybe if you feel comfortable sharing, you'd want to share that maybe you've won more than one. But I'd be interested to see if that data that we've seen here in this poll is consistent with the state of grant seeking report. So this is great. I am so impressed, that all of you know this. You would be surprised at the number of nonprofit professionals who know they're submitting grants, but don't know how many they're submitting. And again, it's a wonderful data point to use to say, okay, grants is a numbers game and it's a timing game. So knowing how many grants you submitted can help you not only calculate your odds, right? If you want to try to get mathematical in your strategic approach, but it can also help you determine how many grants to apply to next year, right? When you're developing that grants calendar, if you say, okay, we submitted 6 to 10, let's stay at the same number. That was a really good capacity for us. But maybe the strategy is, let's see if we can move those grant requests up. If the funder has the ability to do so, if you're at their max amount, you may not be able to, but that's something you can look at. Okay, we submitted 6 to 10. That felt like a really good use of our time if we're a smaller organization. But how can we still be strategic and move the needle, right, in our fundraising by submitting the same amount of grants, but asking for more, if that makes sense for your organization and for the funders? Or you can say, wow, we submitted 11, but we really have some more capacity in 2024. And I think we can submit more and maybe increase our odds of winning more grants. So knowing this information is really helpful in calculating and determining the number of grants you approach in the next fiscal year for your organization, and figuring out, do we stay the same and just increase the amount, or do we add more to that number and see what happens to our win chances? And then the next thing for the state of grant seeking that I just wanted to quickly touch on is that there's so many opportunities for collaboration and information sharing. Now, we are seeing more nonprofits come into the picture, right? And rather than saying that's going to make the landscape more challenging, what we want you to focus on is how you can leverage your partnerships, right? There's more nonprofits doing amazing work, maybe similar work to you. What we're seeing in the sector is that funders are really valuing collaboration and partnership when you can leverage both organizations' work and say, look at the impact we have when we work together. That's becoming it's becoming a more common question. And we're seeing funders really like to support partnerships and collaborations. That's not to say if you're doing work on your own that you have a lesser chance of getting funded, but there's an opportunity for so much information sharing, asking your peers about their grant writing experience. How did it go for you, especially if they're in a similar field? Was it hard? Did you find it challenging? We found it challenging. Like, were you experiencing the same thing? There's a lot of opportunity with growth in the Gallatin Valley in the nonprofit sector to not only partner and collaborate in your projects and on your grant applications, but also just to share information about the experience so that you all can make informed decisions collectively. I'm going to quickly just see some of the we have some responses to the how many they submitted. Some people have submitted 3 to 5 and they received 4. That's amazing. In the 6 to 10 bracket, they won 1, which again tracks with at least winning 1. Leslie submitted 1 and won 1. That's amazing. Grant 11 to 20 won 8. Those are amazing odds. Mandy says 6 to 10 and only did not get 1, which is amazing. Submitted 7, received 3. And Margaret has a really great point. She said they submitted over 11, but they won less than 50. They're still tracking with the grant seeking report data of at least winning 1, but she makes a really good point that they need to go back and maybe be more strategic. Depending on those odds, right? If you're seeing consistent denials, okay, the trend or the odds are in your favor, but maybe there's something within your narrative, maybe within your budget. Maybe it's just the state of the sector that they're not interested in some of those, or they just, again, there's a lot of foundation. So it also is just really, it is competitive, but there's a lot of things that go into that strategy. So that's really helpful data to be able to look back and say, how many did we submit? How many did we win? Are the odds in our favor, right? But if they're not and they're trending down, how do we be more strategic in our approach? Because maybe something is just amiss, right? Maybe something is just off and we need to go back and fix something else that's going on because it's clearly not a numbers issue. So this is really interesting. Thank you all for sharing. All right, the next thing to focus on when you are developing a grant strategy for the coming year is to know your finances. Now, I know this sounds so simple, right? Everyone always says this, know your finances. When you're fundraising, when you're developing your programs, right? It's, of course, you need to know your finances, but why and what specifically, right? What we see sometimes when grant clients come to us, right, is not truly knowing, they know their operating budget total, but not necessarily where the gaps are in their budget, right? Like, okay, we know it can be really time consuming and tricky to develop program budgets or project specific budgets, but that's where you have the opportunity, that word came out so weird, opportunity to see where the gaps are, right, in your funding. Like, oh wow, this program actually operates at a deficit. Is it being covered elsewhere, or do we have some significant fundraising that we need to do? Or is there really great opportunity for expansion, right? If your program, you've noticed is running at a balance, like, right, you're balancing out, or if it's running at a profit, that's great sustainability information to show. And maybe that means you have more room for growth. Maybe you are in a place to expand your programs, right? Um, so analyzing your budget and really looking at the expenses, not just how much things are going to cost, right? Overall in your organization, knowing the expenses of all of your programs, of your special projects, and then knowing where your fundraising or the revenue that you have is being allocated. You can't just assume, right? Okay, well, we have $250,000 in expenses and we have $260,000 projected in revenue. We should have a $10,000 net budget. Well, that's great, but where is that money being allocated, right? Is it going to salaries? Is it like clearly allocated to which percentages of which grants or fundraising appeals are allocated to those programs, so that you know that your programs are running, at a balance or at a deficit? Really spend some time with your budget to understand where those gaps in fundraising might be, where grants really come in as a great supplement, or where there's opportunity for growth. And again, have a really great opportunity to supplement with grants because there's room for expansion. And funders really like to see that, right? It means you're looking at sustainability. You're in a financially healthy place. Just because you're operating at a profit, right, doesn't mean they won't fund you. It means that you can really leverage that, hey, we know what we're doing it well, we're sustainable, and we're ready to grow, and we need some investment to get us there and keep us in this financially sustainable place. The next thing that I think is such a missed opportunity for a lot of nonprofits, not because they don't know, but maybe people don't know to be running cash flow projections. Maybe you don't have the capacity to do that each month. What I would encourage everyone on this call to do is look at your cash flow projections for each month over the course of the year, like what the trends look like. Now, for those of you who maybe don't know, cash flow, to put it really simply, really simplified, it is just your spending and fundraising habits, right? The movement of cash in, cash out of your organization throughout a calendar year or a per month basis. You're looking at that movement, that cash in, cash out. There is such an opportunity to uncover potential risks, right? Let's say there's a few months where you're like, ooh, we do not have cash coming in, but we have to pay salaries and we have to pay for program materials, and ooh, how are we going to do that? Right? But then there's also the potential to look and find opportunities and say, like, wow, we really have a well-balanced cash flow, but there's some opportunity for growth in some of these maybe even busier months. How can we strategically increase, revenue for those specific months? And look at the opportunities to make your cash flow even better and more efficient, right? One thing I will say is this process is not something that you want to do by yourself. You may have a really talented team who understands your financials, and they should definitely be involved in this conversation. But this is a conversation you want to have with a nonprofit accountant. Maybe you have one on your board, maybe you have one on your team, maybe you need to find one in the community. We have great recommendations. I would definitely suggest talking to Amanda Floor at Whipley. There's amazing accountants within this community who specialize in nonprofits, but there are times of the year, right, when more money is coming in than others. And if you can recognize when those times might be, right, when you have more funding, and then those gaps where you might not be having funding coming in, is looking at how can grants help supplement. Now, grants are not a quick fix. They are a process, right? They often operate on a 6 to 9 month timetable. So if you recognize that in the month it's happening, you're not going to be able to do anything about it with a grant. If you can project your cash flow now for 2024 based on what you anticipate fundraising, you can look at those gaps and start to say, okay, how can we find, when we're researching or with the grants we already know about, how can we place and strategically place those grants in the calendar so that we know, even though the award isn't guaranteed, it won't fix all of your problems. But if you can place it strategically in the year so that an award would potentially be announced and given to you in a cash flow deficit, right, in a month or two where you don't have a lot of revenue coming in, that can really help you be more strategic with your financial picture, with your cash flow, and look at how grants can help potentially supplement that that risk, right? Again, you need to be strategic and start doing that now, and looking at when some of the grants that you're aware of or that you might be applying to, when they'll be awarded, and base your decision on when you're going to write them so that the award potentially helps fill in a deficit or a low cash, month. So that's something that I really want you to assess your cash flow and then look at your grants and look at their award dates. If you don't know the award dates, I always say this, that is an amazing opportunity to reach out to a funder and have a conversation. Introduce your organization, tell them about your project and the alignment with their priorities, and then say, we're trying to be really strategic with our grant approach and making sure that our needs financially are met throughout the year with our grant awards. Can you tell me more about the length of your process and when an award might be decided upon and released to nonprofits that you fund? Great introductory question. It's not often found on websites, so that is a really wonderful foot in the door if you need to learn that information and build it into your strategic plan for your grant seeking. Okay. The next thing, and then this last point after this, we'll have our final poll question once we finish this page. The last thing to know about understanding like your finances in terms of developing a grant strategy for the coming year is understanding how grants fit into your financial sustainability plan, right? Into your fundraising plan. Now that's kind of going to be intuitive if you're analyzing your budget, if you're looking at cash flow, you're going to be looking at other fundraising initiatives holistically. But what you really want to focus on is how grants supplement and not how grants lead your fundraising. Now, again, some organizations on here may be more heavily grant funded. They may, that may work for them. I don't want to say that that's wrong, but for most organizations, right, having a heavy grant revenue stream isn't sustainable. Even if it's sustainable, it's not super consistent and it might be a little stressful. So really understand where, just realized I lost an earring. Understand where grants fit into your fundraising plan. What else do you have coming in? And how can grants, again, add as a supplement to either help fill in gaps or help expand? Grants are a wonderful opportunity to really expand and grow programs or organizations, because if you have a strong, healthy fundraising system, right, that is sustainable, it might be like, okay, we're in a really good spot. We're kind of, tapped out on individual fundraisers for the moment. We're in a place where we're ready to grow, but we can't do it necessarily. We don't want to add another event. Our major donors are happy with where they're at. Let's look at grants to grow and expand and leverage the work that we've been doing. That's a really strategic place to be when you're looking at grant funding. So know what role grants play in your organization. If they are a large part of your fundraising stream, that's fine, but understand what that means for your organization and how that can affect your strategy, or what that needs to, how that might impact, your financial sustainability. And if they're not a large part of your organization, understand, like, okay, what is this supplementing? Like, how are we actually utilizing grants? And we'll dive into that a little bit more in some of the other slides. I always like to say, as a metaphor, the couch, right? If we're designing a living space based on fundraising, right? Your couch should be your other fundraising initiatives, individual donors, major donors, maybe events. Grants are the throw pillows. They're a nice accessory. They supplement, they bring everything together, but not what you want to be sitting on, right? So understand the role they play for your organization. All right, Jill has one last poll question for us in kind of this financial picture. It's really important to know this question for your own organization's strategy. What percentage of your organization's funding is actually from grant dollars? I can see Jill smirking, and I'm like, ooh, what does this mean?
It's so interesting. We've got about 70% of people responding. We'll give everyone 10 more seconds. I know there's a few people out there who probably are either looking or unsure. So we'll give people a little bit more time, and then we'll go ahead and close it. But
And there's no judgment if you don't know. That's okay.
which is an option on the poll question. So you can even just click, I'm not sure. All right, I'll go ahead and share this out.
Oh, these results are so interesting. It's kind of evenly split in our first three categories, fairly even. So our largest bucket is in that 11 to 25%, which I think is a fairly healthy grant percentage. That's not to say that those who have 10% or less, if that works for your organization, that's great. I think the less we rely on grants, the more stable or maybe more consistent your fundraising might be, but it also means there's some opportunity for growth, right? If you do want more grant funding, you might have some wiggle room to look and see how that could add to your revenue. Those who are in the 11 to 25%, I would say, are pretty consistent with where most organizations try to be. Those at 26 to 50%, again, I would say, none of these are bad, by the way. There's no judgment on any of these percentages. What works for your organization works for your organization. But it's interesting that there's, the 12% of 51 to 75%. I'd be interested to know from those of you if those are largely like state and federally funded organizations, or if those are foundation grants, because if it is, you might need to be leading this class next because you're doing something right. If your funding is consistent and coming in from grants at that high of a percentage. But this is really great information to know. When you understand what percentage of your funding is made up of grants, it just helps give you strategic direction, right? How can you supplement your other fundraising, right? If you're at 10% or less, maybe there is some more room for growth so that some of your other fundraising initiatives maybe don't have to be as stressful, or you could give your event planner a break. But those of you in the 11 to 50% bracket, to understand where that's coming from, it's also important to know your funders, right? Maybe they're multi-year funders and they've been funding you for decades, and you just know that that's going to be a consistent revenue stream, so you count on it. But, sometimes those things end. So knowing where the percentage of grants comes from can help you plan for opportunities or for risks so that you aren't caught off guard, and can at least be strategic about, okay, we do have a larger percentage of grants coming in as our revenue stream. If some of that goes away or doesn't get funded, what's our backup plan? Do we have a strategy, right? So this is really helpful information to know from a financial standpoint to help you make decisions in the coming year about how to move forward with grants in your fundraising. All right, the next thing when you're developing a strategy for grants specifically is, of course, to assess your program or program's need. Now, what does that look like? There's obviously a lot that goes into program design when you're, trying to understand how to meet the needs of your community. What I talk about program need is not necessarily meeting the needs of your community, although of course that's always going to be a factor, but really the need of your program in terms of funding. What does it need to run? What does it need to be sustainable? What does it need to grow? The first thing you want to look at is your priorities, right? What are the line items that you need funded, and in what order do they rank, right? Just because you need materials, right, doesn't mean that's the number one priority. It might be like, well, we need materials, we need to pay the rent, but like, boy, do we really need to pay salaries. That is number one priority. I would say that's probably the number one thing we hear from all of our clients is we need to pay for salaries. Now, of course, there's ways that this is trying to be alleviated within the grant sector, right? We're seeing this movement towards total cost budgeting, where your organization's expenses are not necessarily tied into, fundraising, and these are overhead costs. It's like, okay, well, all of those things impact our programs, so we're allocating them over, the cost for salaries, rent, materials goes into this program. Some of it goes into this program, right? Like that total cost budgeting is becoming a larger trend. And I think for the better, that's a really great direction to be heading. But knowing your priorities specifically, right? What you need to fund, not only like the expenses and the line items, but the priorities in which they rank will again help you identify what types of grants you need to seek. Now, we see a lot of nonprofits get really hung up in general operating. Now, there is nothing wrong with general operating. We love general operating. We wish they were all unrestricted grants, right? But that's not the case. We know there are still program grants out there. We know there's still a lot of restrictions on some grants, but that doesn't mean you should shy away from them, especially if you're moving into more of a total cost budgeting system. Knowing your priorities and what is most important is going to help you identify what type of grants you need to seek. Do you need to find more program specific grants that you can allocate some of those, indirect costs towards because it's a really good fit? We've seen organizations pass up really great programmatic grant opportunities because they're like, I don't want to deal with it. I just want general operating. So they are leaving money on the table. Now, I understand the reporting end of things. If you don't have the capacity to manage program grants, I get it. That's also a strategic direction you want to consider. And that's okay. But knowing your needs and your priorities will help you identify what types of grants you need to seek, not just the ones you want to seek, but what do you need to seek in order to hit your goals, bring in funding, and hopefully make an impact with your programs because, these grant dollars are helping you do good work. The next thing to think about is what type of services are you providing, right? Not only from a mission standpoint, like your overall umbrella, like what sector you fall in, but also the type of service in terms of, are you providing direct support to participants? Are you kind of a pass-through organization where you provide like scholarships to people, which is more of an indirect service? Knowing the type of services you provide will help you greatly in your research, and figuring out what the sector is interested in. Now, I know this is hard to see. I'm happy to send this out. This actually does come from the State of Grant Seeking Support. I'm sorry, State of Grant Seeking Report. That sounded wrong the second I said it. So if you do click on the link a couple slides back, you'll be able to find this chart, but you can see, and even if you can't, I'll tell you, the most funding, right, that we saw from the State of Grant Seeking Report was going to housing and shelter initiatives, right? The second was healthcare. So based on these trends, we can see there's a large emphasis from funders on these areas. Now, that's not to say that those are the only focus areas for private foundations. This is looking at state and federal grants, that are being allocated, where there's a lot coming in for, housing and healthcare from federal dollars. That may be pushing this a little bit. But then we also see mental health is a large focus area. And if we look at some of these lower amounts, right, animal related, if your organization falls into one of these categories where maybe there's just less funding coming in, is looking at a trend, right? That doesn't mean there's no hope. That doesn't mean you shouldn't approach grants. It just means you need to be strategic about the types of grants that you're approaching, and how much you're investing in grant support for your fundraising needs, right? For your revenue goals. If you're seeing that, wow, there maybe isn't as much support out there as other areas, maybe, and this changes by year, some years it'll go up and down in other areas. So it's not to say that if you're animal related or education based, that there's no hope for you ever. These all ebb and flow with time, with what's going on in society, what's going on at, an administrative level, in our country. So knowing what the sector looks like in terms of where the focus is can just help you develop a strategy that says, okay, there's clearly a focus in this area, so there might not be as large of a focus in what we're doing. So maybe the grant that we're seeking, maybe you're trying to find larger grants, but fewer. Maybe it's a year where you're like, okay, we need to invest in other fundraising initiatives because there is different focus areas for funders out there, and we need to make sure we're accounting for that in our general fundraising. So maybe our grant approach is less. Maybe we're applying to less grants for more, or maybe you're applying to kind of a mid-range of grants, but knowing that you're not putting all of your eggs into that basket because the funding world, doesn't have it as a primary focus area. It's also helpful to know like the type of services that you're offering and how that stacks up in the grant world. Because quite frankly, it's harder to fund things that are pass through, right? If you offer scholarships or some type of relief fund, right? Funders are more hesitant to fund things like that than they are direct service. Now, this is changing, of course, over time. Funders are starting to, really move into more of that trust-based philanthropy and understand that there's value in all of these different types of services and the impact looks different. But the state of the sector is that there are some types of support that you might be providing to your target population that they are just less interested in. So it's important to know what that looks like. And one way you can learn is by research and having conversations. The more you research to see what opportunities are out there, looking through databases, you're going to start to notice trends, right? Like, wow, I'm seeing a lot, like right now, we're seeing a lot of grants for journalism, because there's a focus on that for the most part, right? Like in society, it's like, okay, there's a need for accurate local news. We're seeing a lot of funders invest in local journalism nonprofits. We're also, still seeing, again, this trends, housing, basic needs like food, water, right? Those are still high priorities within and trends within the sector. And you'll notice that when you're looking through databases or looking on Google, you're going to start to notice those trends and understand more about where you fit in and how to develop your grant approach accordingly. It's also valuable research to ask your peers about the sector. What are they experiencing? You know, do they feel like it's kind of hard in a certain area or a certain sector? You know, one thing I've seen in writing grants for some education-based nonprofits, this was a little bit closer pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, I'm sorry, we're seeing this start to change a little bit, but immediately after the pandemic, we saw there was a large focus from funders to not necessarily fund after school programs. They were funding schools directly. And we're still seeing that. So there's some education nonprofits who are like, wow, like we're having a harder time finding grants because like it's just all going to the schools and we're an auxiliary service, but we're not part of the district. So things like that give you information, valuable information to decide, okay, how do we invest in grants? And if it is a year or a time period where grants aren't, you know, there aren't a lot of grants, we run into that with some of our clients where they're like, I feel like we've kind of tapped the field, like we've expanded, we've found new opportunities, and then you start to see all of them come around again with without a ton of new things emerging. You know, that's when you start to say, okay, maybe this is the strategy, these are the foundations that we need to focus on. We're recognizing that maybe we're starting to reach the threshold for now of our grants, and we should focus on other areas of our fundraising and know that this is probably a good grant system to work with and steward for a few years without constantly feeling like you need to do more. Sometimes what you find is what you find, and there will be new opportunities occasionally, but you will run into like, okay, I think we've kind of found our people, we've found our funders, and over time you may get a couple new ones, but then that's the system, that's the grant system that you want to work with, that you want to steward and protect and have relationships with. And that can be just as effective than constantly finding new. I'm sorry, I realized I dropped my phone and that was my timekeeping, so gotta make sure I pick that up. So I try to keep on track. Okay. The next thing when developing a grant strategy is, of course, to set strategic goals. Now, again, these aren't necessarily programmatic goals. You should be doing that in your strategic plan, in your fundraising plans, in your marketing plans, right? Understanding your programmatic goals, your organizational goals. These are strategic goals specifically for your grant seeking system. And having goals is really going to streamline your process. We see a lot of nonprofits come in who are just like, we want to fundraise and we want grants to be a part of it. We know, you know, there's opportunity and we want to write grants. And we're like, yes, we want to write grants for you. Do you know how many grants you want to approach? Do you know how much you want to raise in grant dollars? And often we see, you know, the wheels kind of turning like, oh, well, I know we need them, right? But I hadn't thought about how much specifically we need. So I think there's a real opportunity for nonprofit professionals to get even more strategic, right? You've done the fundraising plan, you know that grants are a part of it, but take it that one step further and set grant goals, right? Dollar amounts with how much do you want to raise in grants, right? Maybe it's specific to your priorities, like we mentioned a couple slides ago. When you know what your needs are, you know, you can approach this a couple of different ways. One, you can just look at, okay, in our budget as a whole, we have a gap in funding that's about $50,000. We know we want to try to raise that in grants, and maybe there's some other, you know, fundraising happening, but that's a great goal to say like, okay, in order to meet this gap, or maybe even to go above that gap, our goal is $75,000. That gives you a much more strategic like guidepost to say, okay, if $75,000 is the goal, what amount of grants, right, do we need to be submitting? Do we want to focus our energy on lower grants that are 1,000 or 2,000? Or do we want to focus on, you know, okay, let's really try to go after, you know, $10,000, $15,000 grants to really move that needle? Maybe it's a combination of both of those things. So you can look at the total gap that you're looking to raise specifically through grants, right? And maybe you have a fundraising gap that's $50,000, but you know you can get 25 from other individuals. So your grant goal is really only 25,000. Another way to look at that strategically is to say, okay, I know I need, in terms of my priorities, I need $100,000 to support the salaries of my organization. I know that 50% of that is coming from individuals, my year-end event, et cetera, et cetera. I need an additional 50,000 for these salaries specifically in grants. And then maybe you move to the next priority and you know, okay, for the program development, I need to develop a new curriculum and get some new materials, maybe buy some new laptops for our after school program. I know that that's all going to cost a total of, you know, again, right, $100,000, $150,000. I know I've got 50 coming from here and 25 coming from here. So what's the gap for that specific priority? So then you go, not essentially like line item by line item in your budget, but really looking at those separated priorities, those high ticket item needs, and say, how much does each need cost, right? What other funding do I have coming in to support this? And where then should the grant goal be for each need? So that when you go to research and you're looking for general operating grants, and you're looking for program grants, and you're looking for corporate and maybe state or federal grants that support a combination of those things, you can go, okay, these are the dollar amounts that are going to help move the needle, right? I don't want to apply to $21,000 grants because that's going to just kill my joy and steal my soul. You might want to say like, okay, I want to apply for five $10,000 grants, or maybe two $10,000 grants. There's one that's for 20,000. I want to apply for that. And then you can build a strategy that really feels more cohesive and that addresses your capacity. And this gets to our next bullet point. It is okay to say no to grants if they don't fit within your organization's capacity to write them and manage them. So you want to be realistic. If you have a large organization, you have a grant team, or maybe a development team that has the time to dedicate to writing and managing grants, okay, then that's part of the strategy. How many grants can we realistically submit each month if we have a team? Maybe it's an all volunteer team. Maybe you have one paid staff position, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, the thought of writing 50 grants this year just to get things out the door because I feel like I have to feels so overwhelming. We don't want you to live in overwhelm. We want you to be strategic about your approach and confident in your approach that addresses the goals and needs of your organization, but also honors your capacity to write and manage the grants. You don't have to, put yourself into stress and overwhelm world just because you feel like you need to get grants out the door. When you have a strategic approach that is looking at your budget, that understands, what you need to submit in order to get a return and potentially get grants in the door, and that honors your capacity of maybe being a smaller or bigger team that might have limited time, knowing how many grants you can and maybe should submit each month is going to feel much more strategic, much more manageable, and it's going to be able to give kind of like blockers, right? If you're like, nope, this is my strategy. When other people are like, hey, we should do this. Hey, we should, here's another grant. You can say, I'll review it and see if it fits into my strategy and our capacity. If it doesn't, boop, it's okay to say no. Whack it away. Nope, we don't need that. We have a strategy that feels really good. It helps eliminate that noise that feels really important, right? Or really urgent. And of course, if a new opportunity lands across your desk, give it a look. You don't want to, just put your blinders on completely, but it gives you much more of a foundation to say like, no, I have a strategy. I feel good about this strategy. Let's start with this and then check in, right? Maybe quarterly, check in on that strategy. Okay, we're submitting, I would say on a baseline for us as grant writers, right? When we're working with clients, we usually try to say 3 to 5 grants a month feels really manageable for our staff, right? But this is the job that we do. Sometimes that's more, right? If we're getting really efficient. Sometimes that's less if it's like a big federal grant in the mix. That may not be the range for your team. You might feel really good if you submit one quality grant per month. And that's great. If it's helping to meet your goals, it's strategically aligned with your, your fundraising needs, with the needs of your program, then that's great. And it is okay to have less on your plate, but it's more strategically aligned because chances are it's going to work out better from you than just throwing the spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, right? So when you develop that strategy and think, okay, our team could realistically get 3 grants. Maybe that's an LOI, maybe that's full proposal. It's all going to depend on what's out there. If that's the capacity that feels good for your team, stick with that, start with that, build that out for a year, and then check in quarterly and say, how's our capacity? Can we be writing more? Or maybe you're seeing more and more grants. You've developed a lot of material. You have all of the documents you need. You're getting them done faster. Maybe in March, you're like, you know what? We can start submitting more grants in the next quarter. I think we could do 6 to 7. That feels really good for our capacity. So check in quarterly and see how not only it feels from a capacity standpoint, but check in about your dollar goal, right? If you're like, okay, we really wanted to be trying to fundraise $50,000 in grants, where are we at? Have we had any responses? How much in dollar requests do we have out the door? Are we on track? Have we heard any yeses? Have we heard any nos? If we've heard a yes, amazing. Hopefully that means we're on track to meeting that goal and we're going to continue with that momentum. If we've started to hear some no's, maybe it's time to check in and say, okay, ask for feedback. Check in with your narrative, check in with, the program design, look at, okay, how am I communicating this to the funder? Is this landing? Maybe I should ask a peer if this is too like jargony, maybe it's too heavy with language that people don't actually understand. Maybe I should revisit that. Or maybe my budget isn't clear enough. Maybe I should look at that and see if there's anything I can do to make this more clear for the funder, right? Those check-ins with not only your grant strategy, right? Like, are you on track? Is your capacity the same or is it expanding? And then looking at the effectiveness of what you've submitted is really going to help you make informed decisions about how to continue moving forward with grants rather than just saying, well, we're just going to keep writing them and I hope something works. You can say, okay, let's take a look at what we've been doing. If we're on track to hit our goals, if we're not, what do we need to do to reassess? Maybe we do need to get more grants out the door. Maybe we just need to reframe the language. And really check in on the progress of the grants that you've been writing and on your goals, and then move forward with a more clear, more informed strategy on what changes you might want to implement, and then check in again in another quarter. Did those changes work? Have we seen better results? Okay, still not seeing results. Do we make another change? Maybe we should still sit with this and give it more time to see if it works. Or you know what? I don't know if those changes are enough. Maybe we need to start communicating with funders differently and ask them more questions beforehand before we submit a grant to them. So having strategic goals that make sense for your organization, having clear dollar figures that you want to hit with grant applications, knowing your capacity and having a goal for how many grants you want to submit each month, or maybe it's, a year you look at, maybe it's different each month depending on where your other efforts are. If you have a month, a lot of people are busy this time of year with end of the year appeals. Maybe January, December, January aren't your heavy grant months. Maybe you have a lot of time in March. You're like, I'm gonna bust out a ton of grants in March because we have the time as an organization to do it. So it can look different for your needs based on what other events or initiatives you have going on, and build it strategically so that it feels good for you um, personally and professionally. So it's not overwhelming, but still makes sense for the needs and goals that you've set, and that you can fall back on that. And then the last thing, right? We've talked about all of these things. These are things that you should be having conversations with your team about, with your accountant about, um, with your program staff, with your fundraising staff, right? All of these conversations are important in building out that strategy, knowing your finances, talking to an accountant, knowing your program needs, really looking at those budgets, really looking at those priorities and the sector, doing some research to see what's out there, to see what trends are looking like, setting goals for yourself specifically towards grants. Once you've had these conversations and you've looked at this information and kind of compiled some data, started to develop a fairly strategic approach that you're feeling confident about, then you want to build a grant calendar and you want to do it for the entire year. Now, this is something, again, like your strategy, you can always come back to and say, okay, we have this calendar for the year, but you know what? I've heard about some new opportunities that I do want to put in because they feel like amazing fits. Where can those fit in strategically based on the deadline, based on our capacity? And start to build out a calendar for the year so that you're not doing it month to month and being like, oh gosh, I have to get those donor thank yous out, and I'm trying to write our Give Big plan, and I don't know what grants I'm writing this month because I didn't take out all of that overwhelm by planning and prepping ahead for the year. And where I recommend starting is with recurring grants first. Grants that are either multi-year, right, that you know funding is still coming, or grants that you've won previously that you know are a great starting point. They've funded us. They like us. They want to work with us. Let's put that on our plan first, right? And then build your calendar around grants that you're already receiving or grants that you already know. Maybe there's a list of grant funders that you've applied to. You just haven't quite, cracked the surface of getting in as a grantee yet, but if you continue to steward that relationship, make changes to your narrative, to your budget, how you're approaching them, you might be a good fit. Maybe you have a conversation with them. So put those on your plan as well. That's like, okay, we didn't get this last year, but it's one that is a really great fit. I can tell by the guidelines we're 100%. This is exactly what they want to fund. Put that on your list to revisit and reapply. As well as the ones that did say yes, reapply to those because that's a great low-hanging fruit. And then again, this goes back to your capacity. Know when to say no. If a grant opportunity doesn't fit your capacity or needs, right? If it doesn't align with your schedule, you're like, God, if we fit 2 more grants into this, like it's going to push me over the edge. I don't think we have the capacity. That's okay, right? That is okay to say no. You can put it on the list and say, like, let's revisit this for next year when we can build it into the strategy better. It is also okay to say no to grants that aren't a great fit, right? They don't meet your needs in a timely way. It's not going to be funded when you need it to be funded, or it's not quite the right priorities. Like it really wants to fund, travel. And you're like, well, but I really need program curriculum development and salaries. Like this just, the focus of this really doesn't align. That's okay to say no. And again, if the fit isn't there, that mission alignment isn't there with a grant opportunity, don't try to make something fit. Now, sometimes we come across grants that are a 100% fit and they feel so aligned and we want to apply for those. Sometimes we see grants that are an 80 to 90% fit and we're like, it's an automatic no if I don't apply, but there's enough alignment here that if I put this in, it could result in a relationship building opportunity, or maybe a yes, maybe a no, but it's worth putting in, right? When we start to get into like 70, 60% alignment, where it's like, we don't really fund what we do, and they don't really fund our geography, but they funded someone we know, so let's apply, right? That may be an opportunity to have a conversation with the funder, but it may not be the best fit to build into your strategy and just put a grant together for the sake of it. If it doesn't align with your capacity, doesn't align with your needs or your mission, right? And your program's purpose and goals, it's okay to say no and say, you know what, this is not a good fit right now. Just like with fundraising, right? We always hear it might not be a no, it might just mean not yet. And grants have a very similar practice, right? It might not be right now. Maybe I need to build the relationship. Maybe I need to reach out to the funder. Maybe I need to change how I'm communicating my program. Maybe their needs will change over time. We saw that happen. We've seen that happen over time. Funding priorities change with foundations. Maybe you keep it on a list to revisit in the future. Um, but it is okay to say no to an opportunity if it is not a great fit, if it doesn't align with your capacity, and if it just doesn't meet your needs or your timeline. Don't stress yourself out and add it on just because it feels like the right thing to do and you want to get more grants out the door because you need that funding. Stick to your strategic plan, stick to your strategy, and say, let's revisit this. Maybe at the quarter mark when we're reassessing. Maybe let's revisit this at the end of the year when we're planning for next year. But I'm giving you the permission to say no. You can do that. It is okay. And then the last thing of this is assess your other fundraising initiatives. And we kind of already talked about this. Like if there are busy months when writing grants doesn't make sense because of capacity, again, it's okay to say no or move it to, if the timeline allows, right? Move it to another time period where it does make sense for your organization. We do see some organizations being really reactive with grants, right? Like, oh, this came across, let's write it, or oh, we need this suddenly, let's write a grant, right? Try to be proactive in your approach. Think about that. Like when you're building your strategy, be proactive of your needs. Now, sometimes needs come up that we can't predict. And yeah, maybe you need to write a grant for it. Build that in if the time comes and it feels right. But when you're looking at your plan for the year, be proactive with your time and capacity, your other fundraising initiatives. What's going on in the month? What's your cash flow look like? How can you be strategic about where you place things in the month, about what grants you're applying to, so that you have more of a proactive and strategic plan rather than reacting to needs as they come up or as you remember them or as other people, give you potential opportunities. Assess those as you will, but then come back to that strategy and say, this doesn't fit. We're really trying to be proactive here. We're going to stick with this strategy and assess later on. Okay, I'm going to check and see if there's any questions so far. Doesn't look like I've seen a couple people have to hop off, but I don't see any questions so far. So what I'm going to do is just show you quickly a calendar that you can use. I need to pull that up. Can everyone see my screen now with the grant calendar? Okay. This is what we have a more extensive, what we call a funding matrix at the Dotted I, where we really go into more detail about opportunities and your plan and timelines and deadlines and all of the things. But this is a simplified version of our tracker where you can put all of the research that you find, right? You can organize them and really list out the deadlines so that you can see them at a glance. You have a place to put anticipated award dates. This information is where you can start building in or adding that information so you can go back and look for your strategy. The grant size or range, again, to develop that strategy on how many and which grants you might want to approach based on the size of the average award or their range. Basic funding priorities will allow you to see that mission alignment and really make sure that it feels like a good fit. And then notes is where you can put any information that you feel like you want to know. Maybe there's strategic notes that you want to put and say like, oh, well, we're like an 80% alignment with this. Let's hold off until, next quarter, or let's revisit this next calendar year. You can put notes there that help make, informed decisions when you look back at this. This is a really great data collection tab that gives you kind of an overview of all of the research that you found, the opportunities that exist. And then collect information that's really helpful in making those strategic decisions about how many grants to apply for, which ones, for how much, etc. And then this grant calendar, right? Pretty simple in the terms of just using a sheet, right? There are tons of CRMs and other really fancy, things that give you alerts. But if you want something just really simple to start with, this Google Sheet attached to your research list is really great because it lines things out with a lot of information. Again, I've made 5 spots here because if you're looking at the average, 3 to 5 grants per month, right? You can list out those grants or LOIs that you plan to submit in which month. And then it gives you really helpful information to collect and again revisit at the end of the year so that when you go back to make your strategy for the following year, you can look back at what you did, what you submitted in which month. You can put the grant deadline, you can look at the deliverable, what type of project you're working on, if it's a letter of interest, if it's a full proposal, you can put reports in here if you wish. If it's just communication, maybe you want to schedule in time to talk or email a funder, call a funder. The status, so you know where you're at in the process with your team. If multiple people are working on this strategy, you can say what hasn't been created yet, what's in the drafting stage, what's been submitted, what might be on hold, etc. So you can have that information captured somewhere. The amount that you requested, this is always helpful to track how much you request and then how much you actually receive. If there's a disparity there, you might be like, okay, we came in too high. They came and funded us. We asked for 20, they gave us 10. Maybe next year we either come in at 10 again, or we ask for 15 or 12.5, you can start to look at the trends of different funders and make strategic decisions based on that, which program or project that you're working on. So you can see again, what projects, like what is getting funded, what you really focused on in the last year. Was it successful? Were funders really interested in it? It looks like I might have cut out the tab for the decision, so I might need to give you a new one, Jill, that has the decision tab on whether a program or project was awarded or denied. And then this becomes like an archive, right? You can look at this quarterly and see what you submitted for which programs at what amounts and check in and see what's going on, right? And then at the end of the year, when you go back to do this again, you have a full library of everything you submitted, what you applied for in terms of amount for what program, any notes that you might have about the process, if they were really receptive, if they said, hey, not this year, come back next year. You can keep all of that here and build out a strategic plan and a grant calendar that really works for you and your team and your capacity so that you have more success, less overwhelm, and ultimately can make an impact in your communities with the good work and programs that you're offering and that you're doing. I am going to go back quickly to my slides. Oh, I just did that. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you all for being here on a snowy Friday. I hope this was informative. If you have questions more specific to your organization, please feel free to reach out to my email or my LinkedIn. I'm happy to chat strategy. You can always reach out to the Dotted I. We offer free 30-minute consultations if you're like, I'd really like to talk about my strategy, or I'd really like to learn more about your services, or I just have a question about this grant that I'm writing. Bree handles our discovery calls and is always interested and excited to hear from you and learn about your needs and how we might be able to help with our services or just by offering advice and guidance. So do keep in touch with our organization as a whole. You can email us, but you can find our website there at the top, and then our social media if you just want to stay in touch and learn more and chat about grants throughout the year. I think we have a little bit of time left. Are there any questions that you have about anything I've talked about, um, finances, setting goals, looking at the landscape, any questions so far that I can help clarify or answer for you now.
We did have one question come into the chat regarding free resources to search for grants.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I see it now. Free resource. So I believe it's still a free resource. I should have checked before I answered. The Bozeman Public Library, if you go into the library and access their IP and everything, you can utilize Foundation Directory Online, which is now known as Candid. You can use their database. It is one of the, I think, if not the largest grant database in the world, aside from like Google as a whole. Um, Actual grant database. It has a lot of great information that you can utilize for free by accessing in in the library. But then a lot of the databases that you're familiar with, like GrantStation, I think offers a free trial. If you're an M&A member, you get a significantly discounted rate of GrantStation, which isn't free, but heavily discounted is almost free. So that's always nice. And then GrantStation, which is one of my personal favorite databases. It's really user friendly. It has all of the resources or the grant opportunities that are compiled in Grant Watch. Have a website, have someone you can contact, which is really valuable. I don't know if they offer a free trial. I think they might. But they have different categories. Like if you just want to look for a week, you can, for $20, you can get a week-long membership to GrantWatch and just see what's on there. You can also do monthly or quarterly or even a year, which I think is around $200, which in the grand scheme of things for nonprofits is um, still fairly manageable, I would say. And I think it's worth it because again, it has websites and program officers you can contact. And then Instrumental is also a database that has some really good information that I know does offer like a 14-day trial if you want to pop on there and do some researching for free.
Lauren also just commented in the chat that if you subscribe to the Chronicle of Philanthropy for an annual subscription of $110, it comes with a GrantStation membership, which I did not know.
I didn't
That
know
is a
that
great tip.
either.
So thank you, Lauren.
That is
Well,
awesome.
y'all, thank you so, so, so much for investing your time this morning to learn with us, Hannah. The biggest thank you. If we could all give Hannah a round of applause, whether it is via emojis or, festive spirit hands, we deeply, deeply, deeply appreciate your time and expertise. Y'all, this is not Hannah's first visit to Nonprofit Cafe, and every time she comes, she just shares so much wisdom with our local nonprofit sector, and we are deeply grateful. We are so lucky to have grant experts in our community. I don't know about you all, but I feel like I took a big deep breath and gave myself permission to live within my capacity during this presentation. Thank you for repeating that, Hannah. I think it's something we all
Yes.
need to hear consistently. I will be sending a follow-up email with Hannah's contact information, with today's recording, with the grant calendar that Hannah will update for us, and a quick survey to learn more about what you all would like to learn, how we can better serve you, and just how we can help your nonprofit. We want to support your missions as much as we can. So thank you for investing the time and energy for being here today. I hope you all have the most lovely snowy Friday. I don't know about you, but I am just enjoying this winter wonderland we are currently living in. Um, have a lovely day. Have a beautiful holiday season. We will see you in January. One shameless plug before we go. We are doing a 3-month long deep dive fundraising course. It is a cohort limited to 25 people that will run from late January to early April. So I'll include the link in the follow-up email here too. But if you are wanting to learn more about fundraising, we would love to have you join that cohort. But Hannah, thank you again for your time and expertise. We're so grateful.
Of course. Thank you for having me back. It was wonderful again to connect with our local nonprofits and to share this information with you. Please do stay in touch if you have questions or just want to chat. It was a pleasure being here today. Thank you again, Jill and
Thank you.
One
Thank
Valley.
you. Happy
Yep.
holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays. See you guys in the new year.